So let's talk a little bit about SQL, which is Structured Query Language. So just a very brief overview, historical perspective, because that's not really my jam. But it was developed at IBM in the early 70s by Cod, who is a name you might recognize from the ERDs and everything else that we've been working on in this class so far. So all of these database fundamentals are basically all made in the same time. Interestingly enough, the language hasn't changed that much since then. There's actually a group that kind of regulates this to make sure that all of the vendors use basically the same syntax. So the same things you type in order to do actions. And the words like syntax and things like that will make more sense to you as we go along if you've not been in the coding world for other languages. Here, there's current standards. You can see the time. They don't update that quickly. SQL's been basically the same for like 20 years. So this is one of those things where sometimes, like if you're learning R, all of the fundamentals of R are kind of stable. A lot of the code that we teach in our classes are actually, there's new stuff coming out all the time. SQL is not like that. SQL is fundamental, which is really nice because that means that something you learned in this class is going to be relevant for a long time. What does SQL look like, or how can we break it down? So there's a few different tasks that we have to do. One is to actually create the database, create the tables and those kind of things. That is all done with the DDL, the data definition language. That's what today is going to be focused on. Even though a lot of this stuff can be done using what's called a GUI, a graphical user interface, some of the more fine-tuned things you still might need to actually do the code for. So that's why we're treating it separately in its own lecture in one day. The next step will be looking at data manipulation language, which is DML. That's everything that is going to help you make queries. So selecting, filtering, doing calculations, all the more interesting things other than creating the database. And then there's data control language, which is basically security aspects and permissions. That is a little out of scope of this class because this is such a fast-paced class where you're learning so many skills at a very high level. But that's what you would need in order to really have more of that database admin type job. You'd want to get a better handle on the DCL. Most of our segment is going to be focused on the DML, and today we're starting with the DDL. Okay, and just a little bit more on the discussing the amount that the language changes or is the same. Although the language is basically the same, different database management systems are going to have slight differences. So here there's a comparison between the MS SQL data types and the Access data types. So if you remember the data types, that's where we're actually saying, like, is this a number? Is this text? Is it money? Is it time? And you have the same type of idea in Excel, right? You can define each cell and what kind of data is in there. So you can see that some of the things are fairly similar, like currency or money versus currency, but fairly similar isn't going to be enough. And It has to be exact. Otherwise, if you don't get your words and your spelling correct when you're coding, it's a no-fly. It's not going to work. So this isn't to memorize whatsoever. This is just to recognize that whichever product you end up using, you need to actually like read the really long, boring manual and figure out all the nuts and bolts for your program. So even though like the fundamentals of SQL are going to be the same, these little things can trip you up because new definitions with new programs.